Let us pray. Eternal God, in the reading of the Scripture, may your word be heard. In the meditations of our hearts, may your word be known. And in the faithfulness of our lives, may your word be shown. Amen. A powerful anthem. It's so needed today, and so appropriate for Worldwide Communion Sunday. So thank you. And the passage from Timothy. I love this passage. And I'm not even going to get into who might have wrote it, or whether it was Paul or post-Paul or whatever. It doesn't matter. It's a beautiful passage. And every time I hear it, it speaks to me and reminds me of being a little boy sitting between my mother Alice and my grandmother Margaret and the rest of the family in the pew that we always sat on at Humphrey Memorial United Church, the old church before they built the new one, and just sitting there. It's about legacy. It's about handing on the faith. Nicole Handsome and John Marsh were married here at Grace last weekend. And Nicole's mother, Vonda, died after a short battle with cancer late last year, far too young. And at Nicole's wedding, at their request, we remembered. We brought a quilt. She was a quilter that she had made for Nicole, a memory quilt, and placed it on a table. And as we lit the light of Christ, I invited Bruce, Nicole's dad, to come forward and light a candle in memory of Vonda. So her light was present. Passing on the faith. Whether you're sitting as a little boy in the back of a church or presiding at a wedding or simply spending time with the kids, we learn about our faith. We're taught about forgiveness, about unforgiveness, about loving and not loving by our families. And I'm going to dig into that piece of the passage a little bit later. But first, I wanted to start with just some observations. Laurie Rosenquist writes, one of the most memorable and profound generation-to-generation experiences, so this passing on the faith, so generation-to-generation experiences I have ever had was when our minister once made the point that the creed is not a prayer. It is meant to share with other people. And he encouraged us to stand with someone else and to speak the words of the creed to one another. To look into their eyes and say, we are not alone. I live in God's world. We live in God's world. And Laurie says, it was very uncomfortable looking into my mother's face, but it was something that I have never forgotten. And when my daughter was a baby in arms, I used to do the same thing with her. Tell her the creed, not just say it. So as we begin today, I wonder if you can think of what has been the most profound generation-to-generation experience that you've had. It doesn't have to be about church. What's the most profound generation-to-generation experience that you have had? I mean, whose voices are influencing your faith today? And how does your faith affect the way that you live? How does it inform who you are and how you live out your life? And what legacy do you hope to leave for your children and your grandchildren? Greta Thunberg is somebody that fascinates me and irritates me. Really fascinates in that she's been able to find that way to capture the attention of young people and the world. I just don't like her approach. But I must say, it's working. I don't think shaming people and shaming the leaders is, but then when you look at it and you look at people who deny it and wonder about climate change and all this stuff, why not? And so we know that she made her way across to North America. She sailed on an 18-meter yacht powered mostly by wind. And she arrived on August 28th. And she's been for 4 years, has been a crusader for the climate crisis. And she has received that gift from her family, I think. I think her parents are very much involved in this particular issue. And she spoke to world leaders, had the opportunity to speak to world leaders. Willing Brangham interviewed her on the September 13th PBS NewsHour. And in the interview, she said, "We have come here to let them," and she's referring to the leaders in the Congress, the U.S. Congress and the United Nations, to let them know that change is coming, whether they like it or not. And since our leaders are behaving like children, we will have to take the responsibility they should have taken long ago. While for many the changes due to local warming seem distant, for us it seems less distant because we are the people who are going to live the future. We are the future. I mean, she chastised the Congress and the UN, and that was part of what I don't quite like about her, using shame as the way of doing it, but if it works. And kudos for being able to take a disparaging tweet by Mr. Trump and use it to her own advantage. She seems like a very happy young girl looking forward to a bright and wonderful future. So nice to see, he tweeted. And so the next day she changed her Twitter handle to that. Thunberg's shaming of those who choose to travel by airplane, flight shame, for instance, is one of the issues that may cause her, and I don't think she's really cares about whether she wins a Nobel Prize or not, but that may be one of the issues that causes her not to win it. I mean, it's a similar thing that's happening. I'm not sure how many motorists may be too happy tomorrow morning as when the Extinction Rebellion group disrupts our morning commute. Although I think that the Adder cartoon about bridge traffic and idling cars is very thought-provoking. The protesters thinking in the cartoon, maybe we didn't think this quite through. And on Friday night, we filled this place. We had to drop the wall and put chairs out in the hall as well for the All Candidates Forum. And we had a question on climate change, and one of the candidates was interrupted when she said that her party does not believe that there is a climate emergency or a climate crisis. And for those who were there, you will know that I was fairly firm with the audience and saying that it wasn't appropriate to interrupt the candidate and to let them speak. But it was important for them. I mean, they were listening and they cared about our world, and I hope that their passion is translated into a vote, that they make their opinion known at the ballot box. I mean, without forums and the willingness to listen, we'd not be able to make the decisions about the candidates and the parties for our country. And just one last aside before I jump back into Timothy. I don't know if anybody picked up the news out of a Dallas courtroom last week. And it has sparked a huge debate on forgiveness and justice, especially across races, around the verdict that was handed down to Amber Geiger, a 10-year verdict for shooting an unarmed black man in his apartment. And for many, the hug by 18-year-old Brant Jean, the murder victim's brother, was a touching moment that came at an end of an emotionally charged trial, and the hug was nearly a minute long, about forgiveness. Charles Finley, one of the relatives, said, "That's a weight lifted from him," referring to Brant Jean. "He hugged our brother's killer to free himself, and I stand behind him 100%. Learning how to live in our world requires us to find those ways to embrace all of life. David White suggests, as he's commenting on the passage from Timothy, he says, "We live in an era that assumes that suffering of all sorts is both avoidable and to be avoided. Living a good life means denying death and suffering, our own and others. We create walls of youthful images, narratives of power, technological devices, and politics of fear that serve to remove us from the friction of relationships with the earth, strangers, ourselves, and God. Cloistering ourselves away from those with whom we disagree has become a social possibility. Christians have long understood that our hearts do not become more loving apart from the friction, or what I would say embracing of all of life, the friction involved in suffering on behalf of the stranger or God. These others cannot be discovered rummaging through the cellars of our egos, but require Christian practices. As Paul asserts, the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline. We have lived through a modern era in which the assumption was that right knowledge issues in right behavior. I don't think we're in that era anymore, folks. Here at the far end of modernity, or some say postmodernity, most have come to understand that embodied social practices are far more effective in changing behaviors. We are far more likely to develop good theology and ethics if we consistently practice good worship, good living as community, hospitality to strangers, forgiveness, prayer, seeking justice, or simply singing, "We Are Not Alone." From the ground of these embodied social practices come our theological and ethical ideas and values. This is the sort of embodied faith that Paul seems to be affirming in this passage, a faith that is lived in families, in social bodies, and across generations in their habits and practices, a faith that suffers even as Paul did and does not avoid the messiness of love. The messiness of love for God, for others, and for ourselves. Remember the little boy sitting between his grandmother Alice and his mother Margaret, and how faith is handed on? Well, folks, it was in the messiness of those relationships and of that growing up that shaped the person that I am and shaped my faith. I learned about forgiveness by seeing the extreme. My grandmother didn't talk to two of her sisters for 48 years, never talked to them, couldn't forgive them. The dysfunction in my family, and it's full of love and everything, but I mean, we're messy. We're human. And we all have those moments of dysfunction, but it is in the embracing of those moments that we learn and we make choices about forgiveness, about love, about justice, about fanning into flame that gift, that good treasure that's been entrusted to us. Now, when Paul is talking about that with Timothy, he's talking about Timothy's ordination when he laid hands on him. But really, it is our ordination or our baptism or our simply being human that is the important piece. That's when we're given that special gift that we're called to entrust, and not only entrust, but to fan it into a flame so that we're not timid, but we live within the power of love, that we live with the strength of Christ and live in compassion and live in the light of the resurrection. And Paul, remember, is always about living into the new life of resurrection that is granted to us in our baptism. Death means nothing anymore. We walk into new life with Christ. We are resurrected. And that includes living into and leaning into all parts of life, including some of the uglier ones. What will you do with God's good treasure that has been entrusted to you?